Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video for the 20th anniversary of one of the most important seasons of Big Brother US, I'll be talking about my thoughts on Big Brother 3, which is a season that, despite it not landing high whenever I do a season ranking, I do really enjoy this season. It has a really iconic cast that does further evolve the gameplay from BB2, namely in the concept of secret alliances, which leads to more dynamic gameplay than what we had in the last season. And while the season does have a few ups and downs with its format, it does end up leading to some format changes that does get us a bit closer to the show that we know today. I mean, this is the first season with the power of veto, which continuously gets improved over the next few seasons, and also the result of this season ends up leading to the conception of the sequestered jury, while also obviously introduces us to the legend that is Danielle Reyes, and we get to see her innovative gameplay. So again, a really important season in Big Brother history, and one that I obviously have a lot to talk about. So like my other retrospectives, we'll be running through the season from beginning to end. And with that, let's start off with the premiere, which does start off similarly to BB2, starting off with the old school narration talking about the house, followed by these short intros of the 12 players as we see them in these very scripted scenes of them finding their keys and get their really cheesy one-liners. Obviously, we have the players come out and end up entering the house in groups of 4, where they make a really big deal out of having to find the right bedroom, and we have this fun scramble with the second group struggling to find the second bedroom, and the last group ends up having to stay on cots with one person sleeping on a bamboo bench, which Jason ends up taking one for the team, which was an interesting intro to him here, being this pure Christian virgin that seemed to put other people above himself. But obviously, as the season continues, we get to see more of his cutthroat nature. We get the typical scene of the players introducing themselves, with Josh leading the charge here and instantly coming off as a wacky character that does rub a lot of people the wrong way. We could also instantly tell that he was a production favorite, but definitely not a character that has aged particularly well. Though it is humorous how much the casting of Josh here has a change on Survivor history, as it is pretty well known that Rob Cesternino from Survivor to the Amazon did make the casting finals for Big Brother 3 here, but was cut seemingly in favor of Josh, which, considering Rob's dynamic gameplay style, ends up evolving Survivor gameplay moving forward. And with that gameplay in itself being based around the games of people like a Dr. Will and Danielle and Jason from what he had seen on Big Brother, it is funny to see how production's love of Josh here really ended up changing the course of reality TV history. But even Josh here does talk a lot about how he's going to run the game, and he ends up playing really aggressively early on here. That comes with some pros and cons. But the fact that he does come off as a bit of a gamer here was something that I was a bit surprised by, as I always remembered him as a bit of a joke. But here we do see the foundations of the Josh-Marcellus rivalry, with them just instantly not liking each other. We also get to see how dynamic Danielle is in the DR right away, where she just ends up being really real in the DR, which makes for incredible TV, where we do get her unfiltered opinions, but it does also lead to her jury perception being tanked by these DRs, with the jury obviously not being sequestered for this season, and through that being able to watch all these negative comments she was making about them along the way. Also, we get a lot of focus on the attractive women during these intros, where I do feel like this season does lean into the sex sells mantra, without actually being something that was hyped up in the preseason, where there was talk about the cast was more attractive than last time, which again feels weird to make that a major selling point in the modern day, though it did seem to be a common trend around this time in reality TV history, with obviously Survivor Amazon having a similar philosophy. But again, definitely something that hasn't aged particularly well. And a lot of that content early on here does revolve around Tanya, and a lot of slut-shaming of her that does get kind of icky at points. But we do end this scene with a quote from Lisa that if this was Survivor, this would be a very blatant winner quote of her talking about how she's not seeing any strong competition around her. Which again, is funny seeing this in retrospect, especially considering despite her win, I don't know if this necessarily holds true. But then we get to the first food comp, which takes up a bulk of this episode, with them being paired up and getting to keep any of the food that they bring up into a tree. But then we get an endurance luxury comp that spins off of it, where the last duo to drop gets $3,000 for every week that they stay in the game together. And this is something I had no memory of. I mean, largely because it obviously ends up being kind of irrelevant as Lori and Jason end up winning it, and Lori ends up being the first boot here. But this is kind of an insane prize to dole out in the first challenge, where it does potentially lead to a $30,000 payout if they get to the end together, and also does incentivize Jason and Lori to work together, though at the same coin obviously puts a target on their back as well. Which the concept of winning prizes, putting a target on your back, is a trend that really continues moving forward in Big Brother. But this challenge does also lead to some interesting moments from Amy drinking the beer while in the tree and ends up quitting because she has to go pee. We do see Josh again playing strategically here by creating the first alliance of the season by gathering the first 3 pairs that dropped, and this ends up being the foundation for the initial majority alliance, with it containing Lisa, Kiara, Eric, and Josh, who remained aligned moving forward, while Amy and Jerry end up getting replaced over the course of the week. But again, Josh, despite being a frantic player here, does do effective work in putting the target onto Marcellus, which leads to him being the consensus boot for the week moving forward. Though to be fair, this is followed up by Josh making an idiotic move and him saying that he's willing to be the pawn, which he obviously doesn't end up going through with, but again, why even mention that here? But also here we do for the first time see Danielle's devious side, where she really plays up how much she wants to win, only for her to drop out of the challenge to save the meat she was carrying, only for the reveal in DR that she was playing up how much she wanted to win in order to gain sympathy, which obviously shows her as a forward-thinking player here. But also interestingly here, we do also hear from Jason talking about his relationship with Lori, and how he wants her to take him under her wing, which I do think shows you Jason's strategy coming into the season of wanting to align with a mother figure, and we obviously see that later on where he makes this deal with Danielle. But we end this premiere with the first HOH, which ends up being the Wheel of First Impressions once again, which I still love as an initial comp, really showing the initial dynamics, though again in the modern season, this could be easily gamed. But Lisa ends up winning the first HOH here, and to me it is strange that this notion of being the first HOH was considered a bad thing at this point in Big Brother, and for a while. Again, it's so weird that this was commonly accepted when Lisa here already shows early on how beneficial being the first HOH can be in setting yourself up in the game. And while yes, she does create some enemies along the way, the benefits of being able to put yourself in the center of the power structure is more beneficial in one's game. And I get that Boogie having a really bad first HOH in BB2 probably started this misconception, but seeing how well the power played out for Lisa here and a few more instances moving forward should have been an indicator that Boogie's situation isn't typically the norm, though to be fair also is based around what type of player you are, where there are obviously players that won't use the first HOH in the most beneficial way. But again, I do think for the most part Lisa plays the first HOH here well enough. Well, that let's jump into the rest of the week, which again, we do get a lot of Josh being in Lisa's ear, taking credit for her winning the HOH, and also putting the target onto Marcellus by calling out how reserved he is being, and him isolating himself by going to sleep early. And really, Marcellus seems to have a really rough start here, and I do feel like a lot of that comes from him initially not being open to the fact that he is gay. And obviously, a player has no obligation to reveal to the other players of their sexual orientation, though I do feel like this is something that other players had noticed. And we see constant mentions of people thinking that he's hiding something, and once he does eventually come out to the cast, it does allow him to end up socially integrating a bit better, though obviously he does start off on a down note here, largely due to this initial perception. But also right away, Marcellus does come off as a really iconic character, being great in the DR and feeling like a unique character for reality TV at this time. Again, this is 2002, where LGBT representation on these style shows have been from the likes of Bunky and Richard Hatch, completely different figures on their seasons than Marcellus. And because of that, Marcellus really is a standout on this cast from an entertainment standpoint, but also feeling like an innovative character for the time. And through that, we do get some great DRs from him, though also through his great DRs, we do also get some ickiness with a lot of personal attacks, particularly the ones that he makes towards Tanya, which ends up being a bulk of the slut shaming there. But gameplay wise, we do also get the formation of the new majority alliance in the cartel that ends up being exactly the same as the previous alliance, but replacing Amy with Roddy. And Roddy does instantly come off as a big player here as well, being well positioned very early on in the game despite joining this alliance late and seeming to be the person with the most one-on-one bonds with most of the house. But once again, Josh gets a lot of content surrounding this group's formation, and we really get a laundry list of good and bad things that he's doing in the game. Again, the noms end up being exactly what he wanted, and he ends up being part of the majority alliance, but we do also see him being really messy, where he gets called out for being paranoid. He ends up having a rocky relationship with Lisa, to where she doesn't like how he talks down to her, and he ends up ranting about her to Jerry, to which Lisa ends up overhearing considering it. We also see him talk about his good relationships with Danielle and Amy, but then tries to turn Amy on Danielle by leaking how much she doesn't like her, which easily could have backfired. So again, despite him having the alliance around him, it did still feel like he was being set up as an easy target down the road. But the pawn for this round ends up being Lori, as someone that did come off in a similar vein as Cheryl from BB2 at this point, with her being a mostly playable figure, though obviously the votes do end up turning against her by the end of the week. Though, to be fair, I do feel like we see more blatant mistakes from Lori than what we did from Cheryl in the last season, though she does also get screwed over by a new twist on the season, that being the power of veto, specifically the silver power of veto, which cannot be used on yourself, which this obviously ends up being a twist that at least adds some new content for the show, obviously being the main focus of the middle episode of the week. But really the first round here was the only time we see the power get utilized, as really this version of the veto just kind of sucks. I mean, it doesn't incentivize the noms to win the veto, as at that point they're stuck on the block if they win the veto and can only take down the person that they're next to. And really this entire twist ends up being so underpowered here, where it feels like the producers had thought of the concept of using it on yourself, and obviously we do see that once by the end of the season, but it seemed like they thought it was too overpowered. But also through the fact that everyone ends up playing in the veto competition, which ends up making it less likely that the person who wins it would use it, it really leaves us with the silver POV here being one that ends up just being a waste of time throughout most of the season, as it doesn't really play much of a factor. But this is obviously the start point of what would later become a staple for the show once the golden power of veto becomes more prominent. But coming into the VetoCon, we do get some talk about Jerry being this Machiavellian player and how he's thinking weeks down the road, obviously setting himself up as this great strategic mastermind, all while he clearly plans on going against the players in power by wanting to win the veto to use it on Marcellus. And what do you know? Jerry wins the first power of veto, and this does lead to the only time the veto is used this entire season, with this move also probably showing the other players what not to do with the veto, as with this move to save Marcellus, he ends up becoming a social outcast, and one that's looked at as a wild card, really up until his eventual boot. But Jerry really gets on his high horse over the course of this week as well, talking about how Marcellus was being targeted for homophobic and racist reasons, and he, as a man with a black brother-in-law and many gay friends, cannot let this happen. And while on paper this is a noble cause, with how much Jerry talks about it throughout the course of this week, and him at the veto ceremony talking about how he should have known better and that his soul is not for sale, it really makes him come off as someone that's really trying to manage their perception on the outside, and doing this more so for his own ego, with him feeling like he has to be this savior figure, which again makes all this feel kind of fake. But he does end up using the veto on Marcellus, leaving Amy as the renom, which she handles really well, almost as if she's willing to go home, as the votes end up being extremely close here, though the show itself doesn't really dive into exactly why, which I do find very underwhelming about the first few rounds, where we do have some very interesting vote counts, but the show doesn't bother showing the strategy behind it, largely because of these eviction episodes being jam-packed with an HOH interview and us having to hear the voters' opinions of the nominees, with the votes being cast before the live episode. We do also have these check-ins with family members of the cast, and also get checkups with players from BB2, which, I mean, out of all these segments, I do feel like that's the one I end up enjoying the most, as I do think it's cool to see the previous players back on TV again, though obviously in the modern day it's not really as useful considering the prevalence of social media. But across this week, I do feel like we get to know this cast pretty well, with us getting a number of segments dedicated to each member of the cast and their relationships. We find out about Amy's love of cheese, we get Eric being called the Lizard King, with him having a lizard crawling around him during most of his DRs, which was just weird. We also get this segment about Josh being the ass smacker that really has not aged well, with him even saying he doesn't care if the women don't like it, which, again, this would certainly not fly nowadays. We do get good personal content from Marcellus, with him talking about his previous engagement, and this leads to the women fawning over him. And again, this does seem to be the start of him opening up to the rest of the house. That does ingratiate him a bit more socially. We do also see Jerry officially being kicked out of the cartel, only to be replaced by Tanya, which in doing so makes the men of the alliance now worried that the women are going to group up, with Roddy already talking about having to flip against Tanya at 7, which later changes to literally the very next round. But again, really funny to think that they had the game so locked up that they're talking about the end game already. But we do see the foundations of the Lisa and Eric showmance, along with the Kiara and Roddy one. We also see the start of the Amy-Kiara rivalry and the Amy-Marcellus friendship. We also get a segment about Kiara's relationship with Jason that leads to him talking about being a virgin and not wanting people to know, as it would differentiate himself from the rest of the cast. And the scene itself here is kind of ridiculous, of Kiara really just celebrating that she got it out of him and ends up dancing around him. But this does play into the strategic content that Jason gets around this season, with him talking about managing his threat level and also his perception. Also here we do see Josh trying to make a deal with him that leads to him being part of a side alliance with him, Roddy, and Eric. And it really feels like he just completely snows everyone that he is just this naive Christian kid, when in reality he's playing way more strategically than most of the other people on the board. And we do end up getting semblances of his alliance with Danielle on the show here, where we do see them playing cards for the first time and sharing information and agree to have each other's backs. And this is obviously the foundation of one of the most successful alliances in the history of Big Brother, but also the first ever successful secret alliance, showing the importance of keeping your alliances secret, as it did lead to them never being targeted together until the very end, but also being able to gather information from various groups of people and collecting that information to where they pretty much know about the entire house dynamic throughout the entire game. And again, this was a concept that did seem new to Big Brother here, where most alliances in BB2, like Top and Chilltown, even the Cartel here, are all well-known alliances within the house. So while the concept of a secret alliance is a very basic concept, it was definitely innovative for the time. But here we do also see the start of the Danielle and Lisa relationship, with Danielle leaking information to her to keep herself safe, but also Danielle comes off as a massive character throughout this week as well, with her impersonations in the DR, which were fun, though also at the same time terrible jury management, as she's literally just mocking each of the players on the cast, which certainly didn't help her winning chances moving forward. But also we do see a really iconic fight here between Danielle and Lori, with it stemming from Danielle noticing that Jerry didn't wash his hands after leaving the bathroom, and we get this disgusting shot of him mixing salad with his bare hands, and afterwards we get Lori getting upset at Danielle for talking bad about him behind his back. And this is such a great scene, with Danielle in the DR saying Lori has lost her ever-loving mind. And this really leads to a lot of passive aggressiveness from Danielle and her telling Jerry that he should wash his hands. And this is all really, really fun, but really plays into Lori being looked at as this emotionally unstable player, to where despite her having people like Jason and Jerry want to keep her around, and her also having deals with Danielle and Josh to save her as well, the vote still ends up being a 5-4 vote to vote her out, largely because of Roddy, someone that she had an extremely close relationship with the entire time she was there, but he ends up deciding to cut her because she is too erratic, which again is an interesting vote result here that I do wish was further detailed on the show itself. But losing Lori here did feel in line with who you would expect to be booted first coming into any given season, with her being this like kooky older woman that didn't seem to have the greatest game sense. But I will say she obviously does come close to staying this week, and also obviously has that target on her back from winning that initial luxury comp, and also does get unlucky in the fact that Marcellus gets saved by the veto, as it did seem like he was going to be an easy consensus boot, though who knows if that changes by the end of the week if he did stay up there. But Lori is a player that I do feel like I looked at as better before my rewatch here, where I always remembered at how she almost stayed. Again, it was a 5-4 vote. But realistically, only Jerry actually really wanted her to stay here, while the others were just voting for her because they had deals with her. So I do think overall I kind of overestimated her ability as a player. Has obviously been rectified through seeing the number of missteps that she makes across this first week here. Now for week 2, which will start off with a Q&A HOH comp, which you will see many of this season. But it was really nice to see Marcellus win the HOH here, being this what would be classic story of going from the block to being HOH. And he does seem to go on a bit of a power trip with it here, though, with him talking about how he's going to make his own decisions, and if someone tries to manipulate him, they're going on the block. But through this, we do get some great DRs from Marcellus, and really just in general, I do feel like Marcellus and probably Danielle are the two strongest confessional givers across this season, giving these really real and raw DRs, unlike the more scripted DRs that we get in the modern day. But we do see Marcellus clearly targeting Josh, all while most of the house wants him to target Jerry, including Danielle, which is a bit of a surprise to me, and I do think it's probably the wrong move for Danielle, where despite her not fully trusting him, Jerry fully trusts her and calls her one of his closest allies, and with him also being a shield for her in the game, I do feel like the amount of campaigning Danielle does to take out Jerry this week is pretty misguided, especially considering the actual results of this week that end up playing out perfectly for her. And this would have been an equally bad move for Marcellus as well, as by getting rid of Jerry, they're really just doing the other side's dirty work and making that side stronger. But at least Marcellus seems to recognize that as he immediately shuts down these conversations and talks about taking a shot at the other side. But it is funny how this week we do get a lot of talk about how Jerry goes home if he goes on the block, though he somehow avoids it for over half of the game here. But most of the cast does end up treating him as a social pariah, with his former alliance blatantly ignoring him, and we see them mocking him quite a bit across this season. I mean, he has this segment here about his sleep apnea and the players laughing about it, and I do feel bad for how Jerry was treated here, particularly from Josh, who continuously calls him a racist and a Nazi, which, I mean, to be fair, I don't know if these claims were warranted based off of the live feeds, as I obviously haven't watched the live feeds from this season, but on the show itself, it does really come out of nowhere and seems to be unwarranted. Now also, here we do see a lot of talk about Lisa potentially being a nom, as obviously she put up Marcellus in the previous week, though we end up seeing Tanya being used as a pawn instead, which I assume was due to his dislike of her, where he does say that he doesn't like what she stands for, or whatever that means. And to be fair, I do think also part of it is the fact that Lisa and Marcellus clearly had a good relationship across this season, to where even when Marcellus was put up in week 1, he talks about how surprised he was coming from Lisa. So I do think clearly they had a close relationship, and that probably stopped him from putting her up here. But again, the show doesn't really properly explain any of this, but despite Tanya thinking that she is safe here, we do end up seeing Roddy talking about wanting to save Josh, and talking about how the vote is going to be split, leading us to seeing Josh campaign, which again, he is a very active player here, and through doing so, is more effective than someone like Tanya, who is literally just doing nothing. But at the same time, some of his campaigning here is pretty bad, particularly to Marcellus and Danielle, where he tells them that him as a Jewish person faces way more adversity than they do as black people, which again, that comment hasn't aged particularly well, but we do also have him lying to Danielle, and Danielle knows exactly what he's doing, but he does have a strong bond with Danielle either way, that through that and his allegiance with the guys, and also having deals with Amy and Jason, it does lead to him surviving the vote this week despite being the intended target. But first we do end up getting the veto comp, which ends up being one that I remembered pretty fondly, but in reality it is kinda lame, of everyone getting a box, and you can negotiate to get the other players' boxes, and whoever has the box that contains the veto by the end of it ends up winning. And really no one tries here outside of Danielle, who does obviously end up winning it, and again, she tries to backdoor Jerry, which really makes no sense for a game here, as Tanya is such a perfect target for her that allows her to weaken the cartel while also causing conflict between them, and also getting rid of someone that she has no game relationship with. So, and seeing her being so insistent on taking out Jerry was not a great way to see Danielle start her run here. But the back and forth between Danielle and Marcellus over this move is pretty fun, with Marcellus saying, "If you screw me, I'll come after you," which has always been a scene that is stuck in my head. But she doesn't end up using it, but I'm pretty sure at this point she was already secure in having the votes to save Josh, and even gets Marcellus on board with that plan as well, with them calling a truce. And really Tanya didn't do any favors for herself either, picking a fight with Amy and Marcellus over Amy drinking too much wine, which is really the most entertainment that Tanya brings to this season, well, along with the peanut butter bikini contest that again feels like the show leaning into this sex sells philosophy, with that scene being mentioned multiple times across this season. But we do end up seeing Roddy doing a lot of campaigning for Josh as well, with him solidifying his bond with Jason, which becomes a pretty important relationship for him moving forward. And Josh says he trusts Roddy more than most people he's met in his entire life, really showing the charm that Roddy has of people on this season that I really don't get. But it does lead to so many people just wanting to satisfy him, and allows him to get away with some pretty manipulative behavior that makes him look super hypocritical from the outside, as he scolds players for doing similar things to what he is doing. But also the Kiara Roddy showmance gets more focus here, with it now bleeding into this Amy Kiara rivalry, with them having a bit of a love triangle, and Marcellus tries to force them to reconcile, which seems to go well initially, but later Amy calls Kiara white trash, so obviously that didn't last. But we do eventually get to the vote reveal where we get a great blindside here of a 5-3 vote where I don't know if Josh knew he was staying or not, but he certainly acts surprised to staying, and Tanya goes out telling Julie that she wasn't nervous at all. So again, that really shows her misread there. But this also ends up being a massive move that continued this fluid gameplay at the beginning of the season here. That again, I just wish the edit fully embraced the strategy of the game. And if it did, I do think this could have been a better product, and this could have been an all-time great week of Big Brother. But with that, let's talk about Tanya, who, outside of her constant talk about her being this sexy mom and other people talking negatively about her, I do feel like she is one of the least notable members of this cast here, where I feel like I really remember Tanya much more for her run-ins with the law after the show than I do with the fact that she was actually on this season. She also seemed to be one of the least active players in the game and was one of the most under-edited of the bunch as well. And through that, played one of the lesser roles on the season outside of how her boot affected the power structure. Now for week 3, where we get another Q&A HOH comp, with this one being a particularly easy one that only Eric and Josh get any wrong answers along the way, and we do see this massive tiebreaker that leads to a Roddy HOH, which ends up being a bit of a boring result for the week, with the gameplay of the week being mostly straightforward, with Roddy having a really easy consensus target here in Amy. That doesn't end up earning him really any ire outside of from Amy and Marcellus, which in many ways feels like this typical early HOH win won by a power player that allows them to solidify their power structure, which has become a staple in modern Big Brother, and Roddy somewhat does that here, though obviously his power structure ends up getting blown up really the very next week anyway. And along with Amy comes Marcellus being used as a pawn, and they do get some solid content together, them having DRs together to rant about Roddy, but also along the way we get to see more of Josh not trusting Lisa, especially after she had just voted for him, and in turn he tries to get Lisa on the block instead of Amy, but ends up failing as you would expect him to do, and obviously this goes against the type of player that Roddy is, or at least that he's trying to make himself look as, so that was never going to happen. But we do see Roddy doing some pretty good work in solidifying some relationships across this week. We do see him making a truce with Jerry that leads to Jerry targeting Eric and Lisa the following week instead of him. We also see Jason call him his older brother, and Marcellus admit to having a crush on Roddy, and really this was probably the peak of Roddy's influence on the game, even though I do feel like his probably more impressive individual moments probably come from later in the season when he's already on the outs. But through the Amy nomination, we do get more of this Amy-Kiara rivalry, with Amy thinking that she was nominated due to Kiara's jealousy, and we do get the first appearance of the Kihora nickname, which I think is mostly just a bad look for Amy, though I wouldn't be surprised if people at the time actually sided with Amy, considering how taboo being open with your sexuality was back in the day. But even Marcellus ends up siding with Kiara here, which makes an even worse look for Amy. Now we do get some talk about Marcellus or Josh possibly using the veto on Amy, which was probably not going to happen anyway, and it's all for naught anyway, as Eric wins the veto instead, and really there was never a chance of him using it, as he is obviously Roddy's #1 ally. And the vote ends up being the first unanimous vote of the season, with Marcellus and Roddy both trying to make sure that ends up being unanimous, despite Josh and Danielle talking about potentially voting the other way. But this really causes a lot of drama between Amy and Marcellus, with her being hurt at how much he wants a unanimous vote, and they end up getting into some arguments here that did put a bit of a strain on their relationship, and Marcellus does have some harsh words for her in the DR, and they do try to set it up that the house could now feel bad for Amy, which could cause her to stay, but again, that was never happening. But along the way, we do get some other important content here, including a lot from Danielle, with her gameplay really getting a spotlight across this week, where here we do see the establishment of the Danielle-Roddy rivalry that becomes a major storyline moving forward. This is also where we get the first of Danielle's iconic blank down, blank to go DRs that become memorable, though also probably become a net negative for her perception outside the game, with players looking at this as her being cocky, which I do think played into her losing favor on the outside. But also we do see Danielle doing some impressive work in getting two of her closest allies in Jason and Marcellus to start working together here in a position where they're both more loyal to her than they are to each other. And to see Danielle and Jason essentially trick Marcellus into thinking that he was the one that added Jason to the alliance was all really good work on her her end. But we do also get Danielle being able to articulate the importance of having a secret alliance and pitting the two sides against each other, where at this point Danielle had really set up a bit of an army here to take on the couples, which ends up usurping Roddy's power structure the very next week, and seeing her put in all this work this week to make that happen was interesting to see. But also we do get to see Danielle still having good relationships with the Kiara and Lisas on the other side that did put her in a really masterful position at this point in the game. But this is also where we do see Danielle being fully loyal to Jason, really to her detriment, where we find out her true plan is to take Jason to the end, where she is willing to lose against him, which again, her full loyalty to Jason is probably the biggest hole I have in Danielle's game, in that she does have this undying loyalty to a person that she knows she's going to lose against. Now, along the way, we also get the Eric and Lisa showmance getting a major focus, but I mean, who really cares? But it does give us a fun scene of Eric sleep talking, which was humorous. Jerry also gets decent content with him getting traction this week through making deals with Roddy and Josh, which probably was the low peak of Jerry's stock across the season. But again, this week does end with the Amy boot, which, considering she ends up returning to the game, we'll talk about her more moving forward. But now let's jump into week 4, which ends up giving us the perfect HOH result here, where it comes down to Jerry versus Eric in another Q&A HOH, and thankfully Jerry wins it here, which really elevates the season here, allowing Danielle and Jason to fully take control of the game moving forward, where Jerry directly targets the couple's alliance, with him putting up Eric and Lisa, seemingly due to his apprehension to put up Roddy due to his deal the previous week, where despite Marcel's campaigning to put the two guys up, he doesn't end up going through with it, though this probably ends up working better for this side anyway, with Danielle being able to use this week to pull Lisa away from that alliance, which through that pretty much ends up crumbling that entire side of the house. But it was humorous to see Eric and Lisa talking as if it was obvious Lisa was going out here, which really shows you their misread of the situation, where Eric actually ends up being the target of the opposite side as a way to weaken Roddy. But obviously through this week, we do get an abhorrent amount of Eric and Lisa showmance content, with them obviously being broken up by the end of the week. But through that, we do get the Eric saying hi scene, which feels really ridiculous that Lisa just swoons over Eric for telling her hi as they were making out, and that's kind of dumb. We do see more of Eric sleep talking to the point where Lisa's actually bothered by it. We do see them go on a date, and again, who cares? Most of the content between them here is kind of boring. But we do get some interesting veto results this week as well, where Kiara ends up winning it, and through that has this dilemma of saving one of her closest allies, but through doing so, it would obviously endanger Roddy. So it was interesting to see her have to turn her back on Eric and Lisa here. But we do see some campaigning from Eric and Lisa to get Josh backdoored, though again, Josh does some decent work in repairing his relationship with Jerry across the week to where he doesn't go through with it. But Kiara not using the veto does seem to be under the guide of Roddy, who obviously doesn't want her to use it because there's obviously a chance that he goes up, but he also ends up following that up with convincing Kiara to take out Lisa over Eric, which is pretty impressive work. In that, Kiara comes out of this conversation talking about how much she hates Lisa, and it really felt like Kiara was trying to rationalize to herself the fact that she was going to betray her best friend in the game. And again, the fact that Roddy was able to make her do that is pretty good. And we do later see Josh campaign against Lisa to her as well by stating that Lisa hates her, which really ends up being a major sticking point for Kiara moving forward, with her using this conversation to point all of the blame of her flipping onto Josh, even though I believe that she had already been flipped by that point, and she was again using this to rationalize it to herself, as even Danielle tells her not to trust the information that she's been getting. But this ends up greatly benefiting Danielle, as by having the votes to take out Eric with just herself, Marcellus, and Jason, and then having Jerry's tiebreaker, having Kiara vote against Lisa really pins the two against each other, leading to some questionable decisions from Kiara in the next round, but also leads to a lot of resentment from Lisa and her not being able to trust Kiara moving forward. Again, fully breaking the couple's alliance apart, with them siding with Eric, only for him to still go home. Now, across the week, we do also see some notable moments. First, from a notable food comp where Marcellus eats chicken liver, and the show really hypes this up as this overly dramatic moment. But it does provide some great content from Marcellus. And we do also get this over dramatic reaction from Danielle of having to go on PB&J that I always found funny. and memorable as it's a clip that they used in her intro to PB7. Also, we do have some conflict between Roddy and Kiara, with this funny moment of Roddy not even remembering Kiara's last name, and also her calling him Hardy, and Roddy seems genuinely insulted here, though he tries to brush it off as if I don't even know who Hardy is. And those are fun segments, but also through this week, we do end up hearing about how Danielle is worried that Jerry is going to end up putting up Jason, which kind of recontextualizes Jason's game for me, where I do think it made me realize how much better position in the game Danielle was, and how the way the game plays out is in a way that does actually greatly benefit Danielle, more so than Jason, with Danielle getting all of her allies to the end game, while Jason does end up being the deciding vote here that takes out Eric, which burns some of his social capital. And while it does allow Danielle and Jason to run the game moving forward, and Jason was obviously always beating Danielle at the end game that is set up here really does favor Danielle so much more, giving her a lot more options moving forward, while Jason had to mostly rely on what Danielle was doing, largely because he's taking out the numbers that are closer to him, while she's getting to keep her numbers. But, everything really just works out perfectly for the pair here, where the vote does end in a tie, where Jerry votes their way in voting out Eric. But it is also here where we get this big reveal of a twist coming next week, where we find out we'll have the first ever buyback, where it turns out the pre-jurors have not gone home and will get a chance to return to the game, which obviously ends up being a common occurrence in modern seasons, and in general, I don't have an issue with twists like this, as long as the person that returns does end up winning the game. Though I will say I don't love how loose it felt like they were with the sequestering of these players, where it is mentioned that they were still able to be out in the wild and have conversations with fans, which again kind of ruins the point of them being sequestered. Though obviously this was an interesting twist at the time, being the first time they utilized something like this across any American social strategy game. And really twists like this for me are typically fine, especially when they're done earlier on in the game. Now, before moving on, let's talk about Eric, who I do find to be one of the more dull figures across this cast, with his showmance with Lisa and random moments like him being declared the Lizard King and his sleep talking being the most amount of intrigue that we get from him. Now, I don't think he's the worst player in the world, where he does seem like a pretty competent all-around player. He's not the worst player strategically, socially, he's decent physically, though obviously I do feel like Roddy is a more game savvy version of him, and Eric as a whole also just has a mostly bland personality. But now for week 5, where we finally get away from the Q&A HOHs and have a crapshoot where Danielle and Jason finally try to win here and end up getting a suboptimal result in Kiara winning HOH. And while a bad result on paper, it really ends up working out perfectly for them, and also ends up being a perfect result for a viewer as well, as we end up seeing Kiara have what I would say is forgotten about as one of the worst HOHs of all time here, with her taking out her own numbers, leaving her as the biggest target moving forward. And while she was already towards the bottom of the pecking order through the events of the previous round, she does come out of this round pretty much dead to rights. But we start the round with, again, Jason being the deciding vote in the previous round, putting a target on him, with him now being worried that Kiara wants revenge, and we do see Josh pick up on the fact that Jason and Marcellus are working together and tries to get Jason on the block, but ends up being ineffective as Jason does some decent damage control, but really it's because Kiara has completely different plans here, in that being to target Josh, with her now feeling bad about voting out Lisa and wanting to make it up for her. So again, she ends up blaming Josh for her changing her mind and decides to go after him, which is astronomically stupid. She is getting rid of Josh, someone that is a number for her and Roddy, and he is the only other person outside of Kiara and Roddy to vote out Lisa. And in turn, she is essentially keeping around all the people that plotted against her, while also not gaining any favor with any of those people, to where even through this week, Lisa is still pissed at her moving forward and still wants her out, which is again perpetuated by some strong work from Danielle across the week, who really fans the fire by telling Lisa about Kiara lying about her vote, which in itself does also cause Danielle to lose trust in Kiara as well, further isolating Kiara in the game here. And we do get this notable scene of Lisa crowning herself as the Princess of Darkness, which I think the common wisdom is that from this point forward, Lisa plays a much more aggressive and cutthroat game. But outside of her just wanting revenge on Kiara, which by the time it ends up happening, she doesn't really even take much glee in that. This really doesn't end up leading too much, but it does fully put her under the wing of Danielle, where they really do bond over their newfound hatred of Kiara, which ends up being a really important relationship for her that ends up taking her all the way to the final 3 unscathed. So obviously Kiara targeting Josh is already a bad move, but it gets even worse as she decides to nominate Roddy against him as a pawn. Again, Roddy, her showmance, and at this point her only true ally, but also one that is a massive target in the house that could potentially go home, which would be an even more disastrous outcome. So again, to me, just a series of bad decisions for Kiara here, but it was interesting to see how Roddy handled this situation, with him obviously being annoyed to be nominated, but makes her promise that she's being genuine with him, saying that he can look it up later, making it really clear how aware of the jury aspect of the game Roddy is here, with him essentially threatening Kiara with, "If you lie to me, I will find out and I will make sure you do not win," which ends up being an important aspect of this version of the game that I feel like Roddy understood more than any other player here, where it does seem like he actively tones down his game, knowing that if he played a more cutthroat game, that he wouldn't end up winning due to the jury being able to see that on the outside. But he also ends up weaponizing this concept within the game as well, and uses it as a manipulation tactic, which I do find to be interesting as well. But we eventually get to the nomination ceremony, where Kiara makes it very clear that she wants Josh out, and even openly says that she is putting Roddy up to make sure he doesn't get a single vote, which is pretty harsh, and we do instantly see him get up to go pack and declaring that he wants to quit the game, which is followed by him lashing out at Kiara and Lisa, and more humorously Roddy over his nomination, where he gets upset at Roddy for having secured the votes for himself, which was ridiculous. Though to be fair, Roddy does the exact same thing back to him towards the end of the week, where once Josh starts to campaign for himself, they get into a fight that is even more ridiculous as Roddy does his typical guilt tripping of, "How dare you campaign against me when all I was doing was sticking up for you." But also here we do see Danielle thinking about using this as an opportunity to blindside Roddy, which would have been a very optimal move for her, taking out the only person that she doesn't have a relationship with in Roddy and keeping around Josh, who she has in her back pocket. Though obviously through doing so, she would end up burning Kiara, but considering Danielle clearly didn't care about jury management across the season, that doesn't really matter, as Kiara's on her way out anyway. So I do think this would have been the move to make from a positioning standpoint, though even the thought of making this move I do think is already bad in terms of jury management, as I do think the fact that she was so anti-Roddy in this position, really heading the charge against Roddy, really makes Danielle look underhanded here, which certainly doesn't help her perception from the jury, which I do think is something that was easily used against her moving forward. Now, along the way, the players also get a heads up about the evicted players coming back to the game, which I did like that they were told here, to where it did have a minor impact on the strategy here, with Danielle using this as part of her campaign against Roddy as a way to scare players into thinking that if Eric returns, that they're going to be back to square one. And while she doesn't fully go through with the blind side, I did like how she used this information to her advantage. Now, the veto comp this week ends up being really ridiculous, as no one even wants to win it outside of Josh, but we do end up with Lisa winning it instead, and obviously not using it. And through that, Roddy ends up staying on the block. And again, we do see a lot of talk about potentially blindsiding him, and it does seem like the votes were almost there, where even Julie in her exit interview mentions that Josh had the votes a couple days ago. So it did seem like the path for him to stay was there, especially with Danielle wanting to keep him around, but instead it does end up being a unanimous vote for Josh, in a position where if Roddy really did end up going home here, for me this would further cement this as an all-time worst HOH. But considering the fact that the absolute worst case scenario for Kiara didn't occur this week, I do think it barely misses that mark. But we do end the week with the buyback, which is formatted in a really strange way here, where in future seasons we do see this dilemma being presented to the players of how much of the prize money they're willing to give up, usually for something like the veto, but that question being used as one of the determining factors on who gets to return to the game here ends up being kind of lame. Though I did find it funny how Lori only gives up $50,000 while the rest relinquish half of the prize money, which technically I do think the optimal move would have been like $1 more to counter all the players saying half, but again, we're not talking about any strategic masterminds here. But then it goes to a tiebreaker question where, in an even more lame way, they get asked how many days are you willing to go in PB&J, to which again humorously Tanya says 3 weeks, while the remaining players say the rest of the season. And again, this stinginess from Lori and Tanya during these questions was so funny to me, considering they've been waiting in sequester for weeks now for the potential of returning to the game, and for them to be this apprehensive was pretty funny. But through this, we get a top 2 of Eric and Amy, which leads to the house getting to vote for who comes back, which I do think works out here. But typically, this would not be the ideal option of how to determine who goes back to the game, as this would obviously lead to the majority gaining more numbers. But we do get a somewhat interesting vote here where Amy ends up returning, and we get one of the more notable moments for Lisa's game here where she decides to not vote Eric back in, which really gets propped up as a great move for her, though I, for the most part, beg to differ. I do feel like Eric is someone that would have been blindly loyal to Lisa moving forward, while also being a shield for her, where they're obviously going to target Eric over her. And I do get the worry of giving Roddy and Kiara too much power back. So I do obviously get the cons for his decision, but I do feel like the pros mostly outweighed the cons, especially from the position that she was in at this current point. Though obviously it ends up working out for her, largely because of obviously the good relationship she makes with Jason and Danielle, but also because of this anti-returnee sentiment that seemed to be prevalent here of the house agreeing to not let a returning player win, which leads to the likes of Jason and Danielle thinking that Amy didn't deserve to get to the end, which is a notion that I do think greatly benefited Lisa moving forward. But before moving on, let's talk about Josh, who was such a massive character on the first half of this season, and while a lot of his actions might not have aged well, I do feel like he brought a lot to the show here, being one of the more aggressive players in the first few weeks, and being a major source of drama and conflict during that period as well. I mean, you could really tell he was someone that production really loved, though it does bring question marks of why he wasn't included in the battle back, where it does seem weird that they didn't give him the opportunity, as it's not like there was a public vote involved or anything. So again, it wouldn't have been that difficult to include him there, though for some reason they didn't. But now for week 6, which starts off with the clip show for some reason. Now I do think the clip show being interweaved with the HOH comp made it a bit more tolerable, but it mostly obviously was a waste of time, though this episode was aired the very next day, so obviously they didn't have much time to put anything else together, though it does end up leading us to a 2-hour Wednesday night episode as well. But the HOH comp itself ends up being a pretty iconic comp, mainly because of how stupid it is, where the endurance comp is literally them just sitting in a bathtub, and the last to leave wins. And through this, we end up seeing Roddy throw the comp right away, which felt like a really dumb decision here, considering all of his allies have been taken out one by one. And with Amy, someone that he had literally been the one to evict her, coming back into the game, it did feel like this was a super short-sighted move that I assume he did because he was under the assumption that everyone's going to target Amy. But instead, everyone ends up throwing the competition to Amy, considering how gung-ho she was in targeting Kiara, who was the biggest target coming into this week, with her being nominated alongside Roddy, which end up being mostly straightforward nominations, though we do see Roddy doing his share of campaigning to Amy, which again, Roddy does some good guilt tripping on Amy to where she does end up considering using Jason as the pawn instead, but with everyone else in her ear, she does switch it back to Roddy, and Danielle ends up making an agreement with Amy to keep Roddy, though once again, a lot of intrigue does come from a lot of talk about flipping the vote onto Roddy this week against Amy's wishes, obviously being spearheaded by Danielle, which again is the optimal move for her, as once again Roddy is the only person she doesn't have a working relationship with. But also, once again, this talk about her going against her word to take out Roddy is not great for her outside perception. And to go along with that, this is also the week where Danielle starts to call Roddy the devil in the DRs, which is obviously iconic, but also is something that Roddy is easily able to use against her once he joins the jury, and uses this to villainize her. So again, this once again ends up harming her game. Now we do see Jerry winning the veto, becoming the first 2-time veto winner, and as expected, he doesn't use it, leading to Danielle going all out here in trying to get the votes against Roddy, and also trying to get Amy's approval as well, which she is unable to get the go-ahead. And through that and Amy's last second plea to not take out Roddy, Danielle ends up backing out of this plan despite the fact that she did have the votes to get him out here, which definitely could have been a critical error for her considering how influential of a player Roddy ends up being moving forward. But we do also see her put a lot of work in first getting Kiara and Roddy to throw the veto comp to her, which didn't seem to matter, but was interesting to see her at least attempt it here. She's also able to flip over Jason and Lisa into voting out Roddy until the last second change, which in itself is a fun scene where we do see Jason literally about to head to the DR to cast his vote, and he ends up asking Danielle who to vote for, to which Danielle has to tell him the other one, which is another point in the direction of Danielle being the strategic mind for that duo. But this week also really highlights the start of this tiff between Danielle and Marcellus, where Danielle struggles to get Marcellus on board with taking out Roddy, with setting up the distrust that Danielle has with him that eventually obviously ends up boiling over in the final 5 round, where Danielle starts to suspect that Marcellus has a deal with Roddy, and after she campaigns to him to take Roddy out, Roddy ends up suspiciously approaching her to work together using the same terminology that Marcellus used, making her recognize that Marcellus was probably the one that got him to do it, but also we do see Marcellus being the one that told Amy that Danielle wanted to take Roddy out, which leads to her making that last second plea. So again, this kind of starts the downhill trajectory for Marcellus's game here. But outside of gameplay this week, it did also provide us with one of the most notable moments of the season, but also a really weird one, in the fact that we do get the appearance of Sheryl Crow doing a performance in the backyard, which is really random. I mean, Sheryl Crow was a big name at the time and a big get for Big Brother, but I always found this segment really awkward, with Sheryl Crow seeming to know nothing about Big Brother and her having these really awkward interactions with the players. But also this week, we get a lot of interesting content around Kiara, with her now knowing that she's going home, and we see her realize how bad of a move it was for her to get rid of Josh the last week, and we also see her complain about how unfair the buyback twist is, which I'm surprised made air. But also we get an awkward end to the Kiara-Roddy showmance, where once again Roddy is extremely manipulative here, with him clearly not being into her, but he once again makes it look like he's the victim, as she's embarrassed him and he's been taken advantage of, and we finally have them give farewell presents to each other, to which both of them dislike their gifts. And considering that, and also in the previous week we had these home segments to where neither of their friends or family liked the other, it was pretty clear that this relationship was never going to last. And as previously mentioned, Kiara ends up going home here. And Kiara ends up being a pretty interesting figure on the show to me, where she was clearly cast as this nice girl next door archetype, but then ends up being anything but that, with her ending up getting a lot of content around her being promiscuous and her catty rivalry with Amy. So it did seem like she didn't end up being exactly what production intended, with it seeming like her and Lisa's roles in the preseason ended up being switched by the time the season ended up going through, though I did find her to be an entertaining figure on the season, and one that felt like a character of her time, with her main character trait really being how much she talks about sex, which obviously the show doesn't show anymore. So it really feels like Kiara would be portrayed very differently if this was the modern day. But now let's jump into week 7, which does have an interesting start to the week, with Jason winning the HOH, finally giving him and Danielle direct power in the game, which you would assume that they're finally going to use to take out Roddy. But it obviously doesn't play out as expected. Now, do you see this montage of every player talking about how safe they feel with Jason, only for Jason himself to say that Danielle is the only person that's safe? And this is a fun moment, but also one that makes you question why the likes of Roddy and Gary felt so safe with Jason here, where in Roddy's case, Jason had literally just voted against his wishes a few rounds ago, and Jerry himself had talked about putting Jason on the block. So despite us seeing these points throughout the game where Jason is a possible nominee and has lost trust with certain people, they do seem to still trust him by the point he wins HOH. And really, his reputation with the majority of this cast is definitely something that propped him up in my estimations of him as a player before this rewatch. And while it is still a big pro for him, I do think in comparison to Danielle, I do think this rewatch made me realize how much better positioned Danielle was in the game, while also being the strategic mind for the duo. And interestingly here, we do end up seeing Danielle trying to manipulate Jason, using the info that she got from Kiara against Roddy, which again, I don't think was the greatest look for Kiara on the jury, with her now thinking that Danielle is using her words against her, but also it's interesting to see her playing deviously even with Jason here, where I will say I don't think she was ever disloyal to Jason, and I do think her loyalty to him is obviously one of the greater faults of her game, but I do think this showed that she was still willing to play deceptively, even with him, in order to get her way. But she does go really hard in trying to get Jason to take out Roddy, and he does end up agreeing to do it here, and we even later see Lisa Lisa and Marcellus also agree with the plan to take out Roddy, meaning that essentially the entire house is in support of this move here. But then we get this conversation between Roddy and Jason right before the nominations, where Roddy has what is probably his best individual moment in the game, and him completely flipping Jason around in this one conversation. Again, trying to guilt Jason into not putting him on the block, to where Jason himself gets emotional, saying that he can't put up a friend that has looked out for him, even though he explicitly says in the DR that he is making a move that he thinks has given Roddy the game. And the fact that Roddy was able to manipulate a very capable player in Jason here, making him go against the entire house's wishes, and his number one's wishes, is really impressive to me. And Jason instead ends up nominating Amy and Jerry here, with Jerry as the target, which is certainly not a bad move for him, probably actually the best move for Jason's individual game. But again, that's not the reason he doesn't put up Roddy here. And also, when the entire house comes to you with this Roddy plan, and you tell them that you're going to do it, to back out of it at this point is a bad look for him, and I do think would make him come off as super wishy-washy if this was a modern game of Big Brother, to where it would be detrimental to his winning chances, with him looking easily manipulated. And again, this is to the point where even Danielle was shocked at the nominations, and it was interesting to see her seem to have a sliver of doubt in Jason at this point, thinking that he was making a self-interested move here, which again, I don't think that was Jason's intention here. Now we do get to the veto comp, which involves decorating gnomes, which ends up being kind of notable, with like Marcellus is getting a lot of focus, but really doesn't add that much to the show. But the comp ends up being this basic Q&A that Jason ends up winning here, being the first and only time this season that the HOH wins the veto, though he ends up leaving the noms the same, and Jerry ends up being the pretty easy target afterwards, where he finally has gotten on the block to where he really doesn't have much he could really do here, and yet it does try to reinforce why the players don't like him through Marcellus getting DRs calling him disgusting and creepy. We've had these like checkup segments in the last few weeks revolving around how annoyed people are with Jerry, so not a surprise that he ends up going out unanimously here, though I did find it funny how Julie did a fake out during the vote reveal, and the show itself makes a meal of this in the next episode, showing like everyone's reactions to this, when it's like, who cares? But we do lose Jerry, who I did find to be a humorous figure across this season, with him coming into the season talking about being this Machiavellian player, and that all just kind of crumbles in that first week, where he makes a very emotional move in saving Marcellus, which ends up blowing up his game, kicking him out of the majority alliance, and not even gaining him that much favor of those that the move benefited, with Marcellus himself being willing to let go of Jerry along the way, and he's never really able to recover from that. While he is used as a number to topple Roddy's alliance, and he does make some short-term deals with Roddy and Josh to keep him safe, he never truly recovers from a game position, but also a lot of the edit after his veto play ends up being the other players just kind of dunking on him, talking about how terrible he was to live with, and despite the fact that there was some promise in him at the beginning of that first week, it all obviously just goes downhill from there. But now for week 8, where we finally get our first 2-time HOH in Marcellus, to which we see Amy get excited that he won, which certainly doesn't age well, with Marcellus starting to get a lot of content about how annoyed he is at Amy, and he doesn't trust her anymore due to her being close with Roddy, which eventually leads to them being nominated together, despite the fact that, once again, Jason assumes that he's going to be nominated here because of him being close to Roddy, and again, for someone that never touches the block, it is funny how many times he is a consideration across the season. But also here we do get the re-establishment of the Danielle-Lisa relationship, with them bonding over sign language, and also we get the re-establishment of the Danielle and Marcellus relationship as well, with them reaffirming their final 2, despite him saying that he knows that she's close to Jason, which should have made it obvious to him how dangerous Jason was in the game for him, but he still ends up planning on working with them moving forward, and did seem to be genuine about wanting to go to 3 with them. But again, we do end up seeing more of his annoyances with Amy during a food comp where it involves pies, and it was funny to see the cast get into a food fight immediately afterwards, but in the process, Amy ends up losing her ring, and the cast ends up wasting some time trying to find it, which Marcellus ends up getting annoyed, and through that, and also the fact that Amy starts to drink too much again, it really does lead to Marcellus being so annoyed with her to the point where she becomes his initial target, which is ridiculous. I mean, to have Roddy still in the game and being this massive all-around threat and thinking of taking out Amy over him is just insane to me. Though Marcellus has like a really harsh speech for Amy as well, with him calling her immature, and overall this definitely wasn't the greatest look for Marcellus. And while I do think Roddy was going home anyway if he was left on the block, Danielle, Jason, and Lisa were all probably going to vote out Roddy in that position, Marcellus does end up eventually changing his mind as well, seemingly due to the fact that him and Roddy get into a few confrontations, with Roddy, as typical, getting on his high horse about how other people are lying and why didn't Marcellus and Danielle just come to him if they're annoyed with him. So again, it's the typical Roddy thing. But through that, Roddy ends up revealing to Danielle that him and Marcellus did have a deal, which further sinks Marcellus's game to where he does become her target moving forward. But also through this scene, we do have Roddy and Danielle finally making a true deal, only for Danielle and DR to say that she lied. I respect her for playing the most cutthroat game on this season here, but once again, knowing that the players are going to see this from home, it does further burn her possibilities of getting jury votes here. But then we get to the main source of intrigue for the week, where we hear about Amy having this deal with Roddy stemming all the way back to week 2, where during the veto comp that involved making deals for boxes, she promised that if she won the veto and he's on the block, that she would use it on him. And what do you know? Amy wins the veto, and she even states that if using the veto will lead to her eviction, she'll be okay with that. And it really felt like it was set up for Roddy to somehow get out of this once again, until she, out of nowhere in the edit, changes her mind, talking about how if she uses it, she'll look like an idiot, which clearly was something that Danielle and Marcellus were planting in her head. But then we get the typical indignant Roddy of him being upset that she isn't sticking to her word, even though he openly acknowledges that he would vote out Amy in that situation. And while Amy doesn't end up using the veto on him, he does immediately scold her afterwards for it, to which by the time of the eviction, she's talking about how much she regrets not using the veto on Roddy. And again, really shows how manipulative Roddy is in the game, and something that I found especially humorous in that we end up getting a segment with Roddy's parents where they really insist on Roddy not being a manipulative person. And really after the eviction, Julie tries to call him out for his manipulative behavior, and he still doesn't fully admit it. Though I did find his exit interview here pretty fascinating, where even before seeing what Danielle says about him on the show, he does talk about how Danielle broke her word to him, and that it's going to hurt Danielle in the game, making it clear that even when leaving the house, he was certainly not a fan of Danielle. And let's just eulogize Roddy now, who is such a fascinating character and player on this season. As much as I do call out Roddy for his hypocrisy and his indignant behavior across the season, he is an extremely savvy and skilled player, though one I wish was a bit more honest about the game that he played. But that obviously leads into what makes him such a fascinating player, in that out of all the players on this season, and the ones that played in this era of the show without a sequestered jury, I do feel like he is the one that recognized the importance of managing how you were shown on the show, and wanting to not be looked at as this deceivious figure, especially at the point in reality TV that we were, where that type of gameplay wasn't as well respected, and you could tell across his game that he was spending most of the game managing his perception, but also weaponizing other people's perceptions against them. However, he obviously has this massive blind spot in Danielle, as he mentions when he believes that Danielle is someone that doesn't care about managing her perception, which greatly factors into her eventually losing the game, though obviously does allow her to get to the end of the game. But you can tell the way that Roddy talks about her game is in a way that he essentially looks at her playing this game in an openly manipulative and lying way as her essentially like cheating in the game. As he looks at it as like, I could have done that, but recognize that if I did do that, I wouldn't win, as the jury wouldn't respect him. And he expects everyone to play the game the way that he plays the game, and when Danielle doesn't play that way, he looks down on Danielle as someone that played the game in an unjustified way. Seeing a player be so conscious of jury management, especially with this style of jury, to the detriment of their own game, is such a fascinating element of Roddy's game to me, to where, again, he is clearly a very skilled player, where despite him trying to disguise his manipulative gameplay, he still has numerous examples of points where you can point out he is manipulating people into doing what he wants. But again, his massive blind spot in Danielle, and really his blind spot for the concept of people not playing in the way that he plays the game, does obviously lead to his eventual downfall here. But with that, let's now move on to week 9, which is bizarrely contained within a singular 2-hour episode, but that 2-hour episode ends up being one of the best and most iconic episodes in the history of the show, where I think inherently it improves the pacing of the show, condensing what would typically be 3 hours of television into 2, which cuts out a lot of filler there. But we obviously start all off with another Q&A HOH that Jason ends up winning, despite Jason and Danielle wanting to throw the comp coming into it, though are forced to win it as they're the only two people to get the first question right, which was kind of humorous. But here we do get the reveal of the golden power of veto, its first appearance here, being propped up as this massive twist to the game. This veto allows you to use the veto on yourself. What a novel concept. I get it should have been this way from the beginning, but its inclusion here at the final 5 ends up leading to one of the most iconic moments in the history of the show. But we do get Amy and Marcellus being the nominations, during which Marcellus is hurt that he's being used as a pawn, but also ends up saying that he doesn't want the veto to be used, as everyone's just going to vote out Amy anyway. Which, I don't know about that, but through him making it clear to Danielle about how upset he is at Jason for nominating him, to begin with, it does give Jason and Danielle the perfect reason to target him now, and this leads to the veto comp, where we get this laser course that Marcellus ends up dominating, winning the first ever golden power of veto, and everything is in place here, where he talks about how he didn't even need the veto, and talks about potentially not using it, all while we're getting DRs from Jason and Danielle about having to vote him out, with Danielle interestingly saying that she needs to vote out Marcellus to protect Jason, which is the point where I do feel like Danielle really lays down her game for Jason at this point, where obviously I do think she has always been dedicated to taking Jason to 2, but I do think this is the first time that she goes out of her way to worsen her position in the game and make a move that benefits Jason's game more than it does her own, where previously in taking out the likes of Roddy and Eric, Jason had been the one to make sacrifices to his game, taking out his own numbers, but here we finally have Danielle doing it to her own, and considering the cutthroat nature of how they have to get rid of Marcellus here, and with Marcellus continuously talking about how he's going to take Danielle to 2, this is a move that I feel like is overwhelmingly a net negative for Danielle's individual game, in pretty much every aspect outside of increasing her chances of getting to the end in that one specific final 2 against Jason, which is her goal at this point, but is also a goal that guarantees her a loss. But again, the tragedy of Marcellus here is such riveting TV, with the stakes being ramped up, as right before the live veto meeting and eventual vote, we do have a DR from Danielle saying that Marcellus will go home if he leaves himself on the block tonight. Cut to the veto meeting, where Marcellus says this is the hardest decision he's ever had to make in his life, and eventually declares that he is not going to use the veto. And we have this shot of Danielle's reaction, where it's clear that she knows what's going to happen here and what she's going to have to do. But again, this is the prototypical dumbest move of all time, with Marcellus not using the veto here. Though I do feel like something people don't ever talk about with this move is the fact that this is again the first time the golden power of veto was a part of the game, meaning that Marcellus had never seen someone use the veto on themselves before, and through that I do think a lot of the reason why he doesn't end up using it here comes from him not wanting this perception of him using the veto on himself, something I do think he looked at as being a selfish move, and not wanting to be remembered for something like that. Now, obviously, humorously, he's now remembered for making one of the dumbest moves ever by not using the veto on himself, but I do feel like this context of this being the first time the golden veto ever even existed is something that greatly factored into his decision, and also the add on to that is also the legacy of the silver veto up until this point. This power that had never been used outside of the very first week, in which, through its use, Gary ends up making himself a massive target moving forward. So I think that's also something that factors into this like taboo of using the veto on yourself that I think greatly factors into Marcellus not doing so here. Though obviously all of this ends up being a lesson for players moving forward of what not to do with the veto. But then we get to the live vote where Lisa is completely out of the loop here in voting out Amy, thinking that Marcellus is part of their Final Four deal. And we do end up seeing Danielle emotionally vote for Marcellus. And we get a tie where Jason is the one to be the deciding vote here. And this entire scene is pretty humorous to me. Now Jason, obviously like Danielle, is struggling with the fact that he does have to vote out Marcellus here in this spot. But it does lead to him giving a pretty long-winded speech that primarily focuses on Marcellus, telling him that he scares him in the game. And there's so many great little moments while he's giving this speech. I mean, you see Amy start to recognize the fact that, oh my God, he is voting out Marcellus. All while Marcellus also starts to pick up on the fact that, oh my God, he is voting me out, and proceeds to give this death stare to Danielle right before he casts his vote, obviously knowing that she was a part of this plan. And to top it all off, you also have Jason ending this speech with this super cold line. Again, humorous coming from this presumptive, innocent Christian boy saying, "You should have used the veto," and proceeds to vote out Marcellus. And this is such an iconic eviction here. Really one of the best moments in the history of the show, this entire downfall of Marcellus. And this isn't even the end of it. I mean, the aftermath of the vote is really fun as well, where we see the shocked faces from Amy and Marcellus, where Marcellus himself looks like he's about to faint as he gets up. He also doesn't say a word the entire time, and considering the fact that he didn't end up packing, being so confident he was staying, he ends up grabbing some of his clothes on the way out, silently hugs everyone on his way out, only for us to see him crying as he approaches Julie, to which she decides to smack him in the head, which is really cruel. I mean, this guy had literally just gone through a really traumatic experience here, and for Julie to respond to that by literally just smacking him in the head was humorous, but also not a great sign on Julie's overall ability as a host here. But again, this entire moment is insane. One of the best moments in the history of the show, to see this player not recognize the fact that they are in danger, not use the veto in a position that they could have easily used it to save themselves, and no one would have blamed them for doing so, but they end up not using it, and through that end up being voted out by their two closest allies. Again, it's just an insane moment for the show, and certainly one of the best moments from old school Big Brother. But with that, let's talk about Marcellus, who really comes off as one of the stars of the season here. I mean, he is a character that is unlike any other reality TV character up to this point, at least in these social strategy games. I mean, he is one of the best confessionalists up until this point in Big Brother history, and while he does come off as petty and indignant at points, I always found him to be really entertaining. Despite that, also as a player, I do feel like Marcellus as a whole is mostly underestimated. I mean, obviously he's remembered for having this massive mistake that he makes with the veto, but I do think as a whole, he is a very competent player here. Now, obviously he is lacking in the strategic elements of the game, and I also think that Danielle, and also I think like Danielle, due to the way that he acted on the show, I do think he would have struggled with winning any given jury vote. But again, I think he is a pretty competent all-around player. And while he does get a bit of an ego by the time he returns for BB All-Stars, I probably would have had a lot of faith in him on BB All-Stars coming into that season, considering the amount of potential that I thought he had on this season. So yeah, I do feel like there's still some untapped potential of Marcellus as a player, where he's obviously being severely underestimated due to that dumb move that he ends up making. But let's jump into week 10, the final 4 round, which is mostly dull from a gameplay perspective, as we do have Danielle winning her first HOH here, and in turn Jason ends up being safe, and because there isn't a final 4 veto, which is a curious choice, but once again one that I think stems from the fact that production probably thought the veto in general was too overpowered to begin with, which is a lesson that I feel like they learn moving forward in the series. But again, without the final 4 veto here, it really makes this round, from a gameplay perspective, dedicated to the individual choice that Jason and Danielle have to make here of picking between Lisa and Amy, which obviously ends with a very controversial decision. But we do also once again get Jason talking about how much in danger he is if Danielle doesn't win the HOH, which I don't even think is necessarily true, where he only goes home in situations where he's sitting next to Danielle, which I don't think were likely in any scenario, considering I think even Amy would have probably left Danielle off the block, considering how much she wanted Danielle to win at this point in the season. He should have been good either way, but again, he's once again talking about how much in danger he is. But this week ends up being probably the best week for Lisa in the game, where first we do have her lose trust in Danielle due to the Marcellus move, and starts to consider the fact that Jason and Danielle must have been working together all along. We also get a luxury comp that ends up being a redo of a similar comp they did in BB2, where the players are given offers, but if they take them, they will punish the house, and in turn, everyone ends up taking the offer, with the exception of Lisa, which I think in reality shows you the naivety of Lisa, but unintentionally, it also ends up being strong jury management from her, making her look like this good person in a house of selfish people, which definitely helps build her persona of this more heroic figure that the jury would have wanted to reward. Also, she ends up winning America's Choice, where she gets to chat with fans, during which she gets to also chat with Eric, and this is all positive content for her that I do feel like definitely propelled her in the jury's eyes here. But really, the bulk of this week is pretty boring, where we get numerous food and luxury comps that felt pointless. But as for the decision on who to take the 3, we do have Jason and Danielle making the very questionable choice of voting out Amy, which is obviously a game-ending move for Jason here, who explicitly says in the DR that Amy will not win this game if she gets to the end, but he still feels more of a connection to Lisa. And Danielle as well also says she thinks the only person she can beat in the game is Amy, so it boggles the mind that they decide to take out Amy here, especially considering they have been players that have cared so much about their strategic maneuvering through the game beforehand. But for them to decide to take Lisa here, who again for sure beats Danielle at the end and definitely would have given Jason a run for his money, but also someone that I personally would have more faith in winning Final HOH over Amy, who again is someone that is easily beatable at the end. And through this vote off, Danielle essentially guarantees that she is losing the game. Taking out the only person that she can possibly beat is, again, still a ridiculous move to me. And while the argument would be the fact that, keeping around Lisa is keeping around someone that will take Danielle to Final 2, and Danielle does do active work in securing Lisa's loyalty in the situation where that would happen, the issue is that Amy was going to do the same thing. Amy explicitly says that she wants Danielle to win this game. And considering Amy knew that she couldn't win due to the pact that was made against whoever returned to the game, I am fully confident in the fact that she would have gone through with this. So for me, this decision of who to take out between Lisa and Amy should have been an obvious one for both people involved, and the fact that they make the wrong choice here for their games is such a major knock against their games, and more so their ability as players, to where they clearly make an emotional decision here, which is disappointing to see considering again how strategically Danielle had played the game up until this point. Where even though I knock her for wanting to take Jason to the end, at least that was her goal. Her goal was always to take Jason to the end. But this really ends up being a suboptimal move to guarantee that scenario. But also here we do interestingly get a checkup segment with the jury, to where many of them already clearly are anti-Danielle by this point, with Tanya calling her a conniving, conceitful person, and Roddy talking about him being upset over her calling him the devil, and he will never forget what she did to him, despite the fact that he did nothing to her. And even here, I feel like Roddy is clearly signaling to the other jurors that they cannot vote for Danielle. And just in general, I do feel like Roddy was a major kingmaker in this jury, with so many of the jurors, namely in Josh, Kiara, and Jerry, all having left the house being very pro-Danielle, but all end up not voting her way, seemingly due to their connection with Roddy, and the info that they get from the other jurors, which, again, clearly had an influence from Roddy. And we can also add Amy to that list as well, where again, Amy leaves the house saying she's rooting for Danielle, only for a week later to vote for Lisa to win over Danielle, which I do think was clearly under the influence of Roddy and Marcellus. But with that, let's talk about Amy, who does come out of this season being a very memorable character to me, where you obviously have her relationship with Marcellus, you have her love of cheese, you have her rivalry with Kiara, you have her alcoholic tendencies. I mean, I feel like there are a lot of things that make Amy a really notable character from this season, but she is certainly not a good player. I mean, she obviously was booted third from the game, had to come back into the game, and while it was a tough position to be in where everyone had already made this agreement to not let her win, she was still in a position where she was never really gaining any leverage throughout the entirety of the game, in spite of the fact that she was the easiest person to beat at the end. I mean, the fact that, again, Jason and Danielle side with Lisa over Amy to take the 3 is such a major indictment against her game to me. Though, to be fair, I think the aspect of who is deserving definitely played a factor into that as well. But I do look at Amy as a pretty bad player across this season, though one that ends up being pretty notable due to a lot of character moments that she ends up having throughout it. But with that, let's jump into the final 3 round, where we do get an iconic part 1 of the final HOH, where it is an endurance comp of holding onto a key while in the pool, and Lisa pulls out part 1, and this shot of Danielle losing her grip on the key is a pretty iconic one that really symbolizes the fall from grace for Jason and Danielle, with them essentially losing the game at this point. Now they do have to face off against each other in part 2, which humorously ends up being the return of this lame series of tasks that they did a similar thing to in BB2, but Jason wins part 2, leading to this showdown in part 3 that essentially determines the game, where both Lisa and Jason are taking Danielle to the end, and both are beating her near unanimously. So this final part does have a lot of stakes to it, which makes it even more disappointing to see Jason drop the ball here, with Lisa really wiping the floor with him here, and Lisa obviously votes him out, to which we do get an emotional farewell from him, with everyone sobbing while he's walking out, and we do end up hearing from him that he thinks that Danielle has won the game, which is certainly not the best read there, but does also make me question, did he actually believe this? Like, was he under the impression that he was going to the end with Danielle only to lose to her? As to be honest, I wouldn't put it past him, and I could definitely see that actually being his state of mind at that point. But with that, let's talk about Jason, who in the past, I've rated him very highly. Talking about him as one of the best one-time players in history show, talking about him as one of the best non-winning players in history show. And I do still stand by that, but I do feel like my rewatch of the season has lowered my overall opinion of Jason as a player. I do feel like this rewatch has made me realize and respect a lot more of what Danielle was doing across the season, where I do feel like Danielle was the strategic mind between the duo, to where I don't think Jason would have had the killer instinct that he ended up having here had it not been for Danielle working alongside him. That being said, Jason is still a very competent all-around player and is someone that everyone in the house seemed to just trust. Now, obviously, there are points in the game where it did seem like he could have potentially been in danger of going on the block, but again, never really seemed to be in danger of going home. And I still do think at the time of BB3, he is definitely one of the better players to play the game until this point, but he obviously does have these glaring holes in his game, with him being probably too emotional of a player still, with his decision of keeping around Lisa and not nominating Roddy when he could have. But Jason still ends up being a really iconic figure for the season, obviously having his secret alliance with Danielle, and that being a major focal point on this season. But even beyond that, being this poster child of the type of player that is able to act innocent and naive, but in reality is pretty cutthroat, that catches people off guard, which I do think is a formula that later gets translated into the super fan archetype, where I do think this ability that Jason displays here is not too dissimilar from that of someone like an Andy in BB15, maybe even like a Steve, in the way that Steve was never perceived to be that big of a threat after those first initial weeks, and obviously is the one that makes that cutthroat move at the very end to cut Vanessa. I feel like Jason is the prototype for that sort of archetype, and through that ends up being a very important figure in Big Brother history. But now let's jump into the rest of the finale, which I do think is up there as one of the best finales in the history of the show, where we do first see Danielle revealing her game to Lisa, which I do think is a suboptimal move for her, considering this, of course, gives Lisa time to form a counter argument against Danielle by the time they get to jury questioning, but it does also lead to a fun moment for the show here. But we do get to see the jury reuniting, and I've always liked these segments in old school Big Brother, where obviously the jury has watched the show and through that are able to react to things that they saw on the show, and we get to see some of the players reconciling there, but eventually they get around to talking about the final 2, with Jason clearly trying to stump for Danielle here, but seeming to just fall on deaf ears, despite the fact that most of the jury seems to acknowledge the fact that Lisa got extremely lucky to even get to the final 2 to begin with. with Josh in particular really leading this charge in talking up Danielle's game, despite the fact that he doesn't end up voting for her to win. Even though he even says that knocking Danielle's game is to not understand the game, but he doesn't follow through with it. But again, there's also a lot of talk about Lisa being this selfless person, and also this weird misconception that they talk about how Danielle did none of the dirty work, which really makes no sense. I don't really get where they got that from, but here we obviously have Roddy being on his high horse, as always, which does lead to Kiara also mentioning that she doesn't like the way that Danielle treated Roddy. So through that and her apologizing to Roddy herself, made it pretty clear of where her decision was leaning. And again, making it more obvious that Roddy did play such a major factor into how this jury was thinking and greatly factored into this anti-Danielle sentiment that was there. But then we get to the actual jury questioning, which was very light on Lisa, where it felt like they were really giving her softball questions that made it pretty clear that she was already the likely winner. And we even have like Kiara's question, which is just ridiculous, where she literally just asks if she forgives her. All while Danielle gets called out for her DRs and gets asked if she thinks she played ethically across the season. And you can clearly tell that Danielle knew she was going to lose the game at this point. Though I will say, I do also feel like her performance as a whole here wasn't the greatest. I mean, while she doesn't do anything egregiously bad, I really feel like she fails to play into what the jury wanted from her, though to be fair, I don't know how she would have gotten their votes anyway. And I do find it humorous how smug Roddy is with the jury questioning here as well, with him giving them both pretty big softball questions, which largely seem to be him, again, trying to preserve his reputation, all while knowing that he is the one that made the jury as bitter as they are against Danielle, once again making it look like he is this good guy, when in reality he is the reason why Danielle's getting as much criticism as she is. And this feeling like the true win for Roddy to have Danielle lose in this way. But we do end the jury questioning with a really great scene between Jason and Danielle, where Jason just thanks her for helping him in the game and gets emotional while doing so. And I always love this scene as a way to culminate these two's relationship across the season, where obviously it ends up with Jason being the only one to vote for Danielle at the end, but did feel like a true heartwarming moment here. But then we get to the vote reveal, which is done in a similar way to how it was done in BB2, however worse in the fact that they aren't allowed to talk about why they voted the way that they did. So we have the players one by one revealing their keys, but again, without the explanations, it ends up being them just kind of rushing through it. And if you aren't going to use this aspect of allowing the jurors to talk about their votes, then I feel like we're just better off having Julie read them as they eventually do from BB5 on. It does end up being a 9-1 vote where Lisa is declared the winner, to where once again Roddy does come off really smug when he reveals his vote, where he says, "Congratulations, Lisa." And again, obviously this ends up being a really controversial jury decision, and one that is often credited with the creation of the sequestered jury that starts from BB4 on, which I guess means we might as well talk about the conception of the sequestered jury, which I do think there is some people that misunderstand the purpose of the sequestered jury, where I think a lot of people are under the assumption that the sequestered jury was created to make the game more fair because production was like upset that Danielle lost the game, when in reality that's not the purpose of the sequestered jury. From a production standpoint, the purpose of a sequestered jury is to guarantee people are more open in the DRs, more so than keeping the game fair, which I don't think production cares that much about, especially in the concept of who wins Big Brother. I don't think production cares who wins their seasons typically, but what they do care about is the content that they're getting for their show. And if players are on a show where these DRs are going to be shown to the jury members and can have a massive impact on who those players end up voting for, then obviously players are going to hold back in the DR or even blatantly lie in the DR, which is why they made the sequestered jury, to make sure they can still have good TV here and make the players feel safe while in the DR. But also with that, I might as well talk about the impact that the sequestered jury would have had on this season, which, I'll be honest, I don't think it would have changed that much. Well, yes, certainly it would have helped Danielle keep some of the votes that she had immediately after they left the house. I do still fully believe Lisa would have beaten Danielle even with the current jury format, where with the jury having been sequestered together in the house, I do still feel like Roddy was upset enough at Danielle to where even before he saw the tapes, I do think he would have had this very anti-Danielle sentiment to where, yes, I do think the tapes allowed him to weaponize his anger against Danielle in a more concise way, but I do still feel like living in the jury house, he would have had a lot of influence over the likes of Josh and Kiara, and probably would have still had someone like a Marcellus be able to change Amy's mind. So I do feel like the sequestered jury being added here isn't something that actually would have gave Danielle the win. Mind you, I do think something that would have is a fully sequestered jury, a jury that is sequestered even from each other, which again is not going to happen and never will happen. But if that were to happen, I do think Danielle could have won that, where players had not had the influence of people like a Marcellus or a Roddy there to influence their decisions. I do feel like the likes of Lori, of Josh, of Kiara, of Jerry, of Amy were all leaning Danielle at the time that they left the house. So that is what would truly cause an impact on this jury vote. But the current jury format of having them all live in a singular house would not be enough to give Danielle the win here. But again, the point of the sequestered jury is more so to guarantee that the cast is going to bring entertainment to the show, more so than it is about how it's going to actually affect the results of the season itself. But overall, the Lisa win here to me is a bit of a mixed bag. It's something that I do think adds to the season in terms of its legacy of seeing how Jason and Danielle dominated most of the game, but really just dropped the ball at the end. And I do think that adds some sort of appeal to the season that the obvious result doesn't end up happening. Though obviously it would have been fantastic to see Danielle Reyes pull out the win here and to see how that changes Big Brother history moving forward, where I do think it would have set this precedent that aggressive gameplay is going to be rewarded instead of the opposite that ends up being represented here. But to me, I do still feel like Lisa's win here fits within the arc of the season. I think it's still a satisfying conclusion to the season in what is a fantastic season of old school Big Brother here. Before wrapping up the video, let's talk about the final two, starting off with Danielle, who is obviously a very innovative player in the history of Big Brother. I mean, the way that she approaches the game and the creation of this secret alliance, and also the concept of aligning with someone that no one would expect you to be aligned with, is something that really sets an important precedent for the game moving forward, where we have this strategy being one that people attempt to replicate many times moving forward, and later plays into the creation of the Brigade, which is obviously known as one of the best alliances of all time. And I think through the Brigade also transforms into the Bomb Squad, and through that gives us the modern game structure of still having a secret alliance, but being surrounded by a public alliance, of people still keeping their true allegiances secret, but wrapping that around a massive power structure. And I do think the evolution of alliance building can be attributed all the way back to the way that Danielle approaches it back here in BB3. But even beyond this, her strategy even has a great impact on Survivor as well, where we do see Rob Cesternino take the strategy that he had seen her execute here and try to use it in the Amazon, which greatly impacts that season. And I mean, like, to me, Danielle Reyes is one of the biggest game changers in not only the history of Big Brother, but also just all of reality television. And not even just in the way that she approaches the game, but also in the type of character that she is, where she really relishes in playing this extremely aggressive strategic game. And to me, that really makes her a riveting character across this season. Also, one I still do have holes with in her game. Again, she does not play a perfect game of Big Brother, and also considering the fact that she knew the format of the show coming into it, she plays far from a perfect game of Big Brother. I mean, her jury management is straight up abhorrent at points, where she should have known that these people were going to be able to see her DRs when going home. And the fact that she knew someone like a Roddy was going to be an influential figure outside of the house, and for her to constantly villainize him on their show was, and considering the type of person that Roddy is, it was clearly going to lose her multiple jury votes there. But in terms of the way that she navigates her way through the game and getting to the end of the game, she does play that part of the game near perfectly here, having everyone in the house wanting to take her to the end by the time of the final five. And even beyond that, she had great individual relationships with the likes of Jerry and Kiara and Josh, to where Roddy was really the only person that she was not able to build a genuine bond with. And with her being that well positioned in the game, she still had winning scenarios despite how poor her jury management was, to where I do feel like she clearly wins against Amy at the end. And even beyond that, might have even possibly been Marcellus, considering Marcellus also did not have the greatest jury management as well. I mean, the obvious problem is the path that she takes to the end, where she decides to go against the two biggest jury threats, instead of taking those that she can more obviously beat. And a lot of that comes down to her loyalty to Jason and her having this emotional connection to Lisa. But again, I feel like that shows the fundamental flaws in how she played this game, being this extremely cutthroat player for a lot of it, to where it turned off a lot of the jury members, but still not being cutthroat enough to optimize her chance of winning the game by going to the end against people who were not respected by the jury. Now, obviously, Danielle Reyes is a player that I still consider to be one of the best to ever play. However, I would say that just from her BB3 game, I would still have a lot of question marks over her overall game ability. To where the reason I do, to this day, consider her one of the best players to ever play is because of her strong appearance in BB7. To where it's obviously not a game that's nearly as strong as her BB3 one, but I do think the fact that she was able to do as well as she did with the massive target that was on her back really solidifies my faith in her overall game ability. But considering the point that we're at in Big Brother history, I mean, she clearly plays one of the most impressive games we had ever seen and probably will see for a little while. But with that, let's move on to Lisa, who for a while was obviously looked at as an undeserving winner. However, across time, I do think people had gone up in their estimations of Lisa, to the point where I do think now she's probably gotten a bit too high. I do think Lisa is a good player of Big Brother. Yeah, I do think she would have a lot of potential if she were to play again. However, I do think people overrate her BB3 game. I do think her game is still deeply flawed, with a lot of her game being dictated by the success of Jason and Danielle, to where obviously you have to give her credit for building such a strong bond with Jason and Danielle to where they take her to Final 3. But even then, I don't know how much of that was very active on her end. And I think there are multiple other points across the season that you can point out where she is making suboptimal moves for her game and didn't really even know what was truly going on in the game. But I do think Lisa is kind of the first winner to be in this mold of the stereotypical Big Brother winner, a competent all-around player that finds himself in the initial majority and is able to set up a power structure around them early on. Now, obviously, she doesn't come anywhere close to perfecting this mold in the way that someone like a Derek is able to break this solid gameplay moving forward, where her game is much more rocky than the likes of a Drew or a Hayden or a Derek or a Cody, who are winners that, again, start off in this similar mold, but are able to retain more of the power moving forward in the game. Again, Lisa's game really crumbles at the time of the Eric eviction, and from there, she's kind of just being in the back seat while Danielle's dragging her through the game. But I do think it really does set up this initial prototype of what is the most optimal way to play Big Brother, even though Lisa wasn't able to fully play out in that optimal way. And through that, my thoughts on Lisa as a winner have mostly stayed the same through this rewatch. If not, maybe went down a tinge, mainly because I just don't know how much of her game was intentional, and I do largely suspect a lot of it wasn't. But again, I do feel like her arc across this season still does lead to a satisfying conclusion to it. But there we go. I mean, that's the entire season of Big Brother 3. Obviously, a very important season to the show that further involved the gameplay way beyond that of Big Brother 2's, while also providing some iconic characters and moments along the way, and also showing the foundations of what would be some of the more important format changes that would become more standard in modern Big Brother. So again, it's a season I do really love, and despite it not being one of the higher rated seasons for me in a season ranking, it's still a mostly consistent season through and through, and one that I adore nonetheless. So there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on Big Brother 3, 20 years after its initial airing. Now, like my other retrospectives, I will be doing a player ranking for this season at some point down the road. Also, I'll probably be doing a very similar thing for Big Brother 4 next year. And I'm obviously doing a similar thing for Survivor, where Survivor Thailand's anniversary comes up in a few months, so stay tuned for those. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.